I don't think you can overstate the importance of strength training. I just don't think there's anybody out there who shouldn't be lifting weights. I can't think of a case. I mean, unless you're decidedly saying, I don't want to live the longest, healthiest life I can. If that's the case, then by all means don't lift weights. But if you're in the camp that says, I want to maximize how well I can live and maybe even how long I can live, what should I do? Then you have to be lifting weights regardless of age, regardless of sex, regardless of injury. You have to work around all of those things. Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia.
Peter, welcome to a special episode. How you doing?
Very well, thank you.
So today's episode is special in that it's kind of shot like an AMA, but it's going to be available to everyone. And what we're going to cover is one of the most common questions that we see come through day in, day out to the website is whether people who are quote unquote older, let's say just for general purposes for this conversation, 50 plus, who realize the importance of exercise, but are wondering if it's too late for them to start. And this could be whether they've never trained or worry about injury, they don't know what to do or how to do it, or they just think, you know what, it's too late for them to really make a difference. And so we wanted to create an episode for that group, 50 plus, who have not been exercising but want to start. And although much of what we'll talk about applies to anyone in that age category, it also can apply to anyone of any age who is deconditioned and looking to start slow. With that said, too, anyone who's younger most likely has parents who might be in this position, and this could be a good episode to send to them to encourage them to start. And so how we're going to structure it is a little less technical than some of our AMAs and much more conversational as to how you would speak to these people if they were your patients and came to you and were asking you these questions. In the show notes, we'll have the studies that you talk about. We'll link to them. We'll link to other content that goes much deeper, but this will be a little bit more on that conversational side. So with all that said, anything you want to add as someone who is now in the quote unquote older category as well?
Yeah, my wife likes to refer to me as an older gentleman now. So that's right. I'm in the over 50 category, not just 50, but over 50. So a couple things. One, as we thought about putting this together, the goal initially was to have no figures, no studies, just really put all of that in the show notes, but let us talk. And I've sort of begged to have a few figures because I do think that there are times when a picture just says a lot. So for folks who are listening to us, there's going to be a few times when I'm going to reference some figures from studies that I think really do a lot. I guess a couple things to state is that, and we'll talk about this in detail, but I think we talk about 50 being a turning point. I think another really big turning point is 65 plus. And again, we'll get to some of these things, but we really start to notice reduction in strength at about that age. We start to see vestibular changes that occur around that age, and that probably contributes significantly to something we will talk about, which is the risk of falling. So while I think everything we're going to talk about is going to be relevant to anybody who's over 50 and untrained, I will probably call out specifically areas where when we get into that 60 to 65-year-old camp, we want to be even more, mindful of things.
And so I think to start, you've spoken at length about the importance of exercise for longevity, so I don't think we need to start there. But let's say someone heard that message, is in that 50 plus, 65 plus category, hasn't been exercising, and they come to you and say, is it too late for me to start doing this? Is it too late for me to worry about this and start making changes? I think it'd be helpful for people first to hear, how would you even respond to that?
I've had the same response largely for many years now, so I realize that some people will have already heard me say this, whether it's on another podcast, but truthfully, I haven't come up with a better analogy yet. And it's really the analogy of saving for retirement. So if you could be talking to somebody who's in high school or college and you were talking to them through the lens of, being a financial advisor, their fiduciary, what would you say? Well, you would say, listen, there's this really magical thing called compounding that Einstein basically said was the eighth wonder of the world, and you want to use it to maximum advantage. And to do that, you should start saving immediately, right? If you can start saving, before you even, when you get your first job, you should be saving. And if not, certainly by the time you get out of college, you should be saving. And if you do that, you don't really have to be that brilliant about it, right? You just, if you put all of your savings into an index fund at the age of 22, the probability that you are not going to be set when you retire is so low. Okay, so that's great. But what happens if you're talking to somebody who's 45 and due to life circumstances, like they just haven't been able to save. They haven't made enough money to even have some disposable saving income, or they've had, they've saved and lost or invested badly or something like that. Would you say, well, too bad? No, of course you wouldn't. So I guess the point here is it is never too late to start saving for retirement, but you must understand something, which is the longer you wait to start, the more you're likely going to have to save, the greater return you're going to need, and therefore probably the greater risk you're going to take. So it's never too late to start saving, and it's never too late to start exercising. But I want the message to be, don't wait because of some reason and say, well, I'm going to wait till I'm older because, so anyway, to me, that's the best way to think about this.
And I think it will be helpful for this conversation because we'll touch on these various aspects as it relates to exercise in this age population. But can you just remind people of your 4 pillars and kind of how you think about each of those pillars individually as someone is aging?
Yeah, and sometimes I think of it as 3 or 4, but I think I think I'd write about it as 4, so I'll stick with that. But it's basically stability, strength, aerobic efficiency, and peak aerobic output. And you could argue, well, those are just kind of a continuum. And so I would say, sure, but let's not get lost in the semantics. Those things, if you define them the way I do, kind of constitute everything. Again, stability is kind of a broad term, but embedded within stability is everything that enables you to dissipate force safely, everything that enables you to have balance and flexibility, because believe it or not, those come from stability, right? If you have balance, by definition, you have stability. You can't have balance without stability. You can't actually have flexibility without stability. So, we think of training as having a purpose, and of course, different types of training factor into these different activities. So there are some types of training that really kind of myopically hit one of these things. So if you're riding a bike like I do for your zone 2 training, well, first of all, riding a bike is a very one-dimensional activity. There are basically no degrees of freedom outside of you riding, pedaling the crank. And if you do it at a fixed power output that meets the criteria for zone 2, then you're very narrowly targeting that. You're doing very little for any of the other systems. And then conversely, there are other types of training like rucking with a heavy weight on hills, where actually you're targeting all 4 of those elements, right? That requires tremendous stability, moments of strength, large segments of aerobic base or aerobic efficiency, and moments of peak aerobic output and even anaerobic output. So that's just something to kind of, keep in mind.
And so, Peter, you mentioned at the outset, there's a few graphs that you think will be important. I think be a good spot for us to pull them up, which is one looking at the decline of muscle as we age, so people can kind of visually see what that looks like. And then one looking at VO2 max across different age brackets. And so I'll share my screen here and pull them up, but I think it'll be helpful for people if you kind of talk through them and how you look at it through the lens of this conversation.
Yeah, so this is a figure that I fought like crazy to include and outlive, and I got overruled and just kicked in the groin. No way this figure was going in the book. So it really makes me happy to be able to show this figure here. The figure, for those who are not watching, shows it's basically 4 graphs, and Two of them are for men, two of them are for women. Two of them demonstrate fat-free mass, which is a great proxy for muscle mass, and two of them show spontaneous or deliberate physical activity. So in that sense, you can think of it as a 2x2, male by female versus activity and fat-free mass. And then each of these has kind of an x-axis that shows age. Okay, so what one notices when they look at this is that fat-free mass, rises up. So, i.e., lean mass kind of rises pretty significantly from birth till about the age of 25. And then it slowly starts to go down. By the way, this is true for males and females. Males are on the right, females are on the left. So you'll notice that from age 25 to 75, there is indeed a gradual reduction of lean mass. But then something happens at the age of 75, which is the fall off in lean mass becomes much more significant. It's actually even more noticeable in men, presumably because they're starting from a higher baseline. But this is clearly a curve that has three segments, right? Birth to 25, where you're gaining. 25 to 75, where you're slowly losing. And by the way, we know the numbers, right? We know that that's actually happening at 8 to 10% per year. And then 75 and on, where you fall off a cliff. So now let's look at the lower figures. The lower figures show physical activity level. And you can see that a very similar trend occurs. It tends to peak a little bit earlier, so it's probably peaking in late teens and early 20s. And interestingly, it doesn't have a huge fall off between the ages of roughly 20 and 75. It actually stays relatively constant. If anything, it probably dips a touch in middle age. That might have to do when we're at sort of peak work and therefore not as busy physically. But again, you notice what happens at the age of 75, which is physical activity level drops like a stone. And of course, this begs the age-old question, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Because again, there is an unmistakable relationship here between physical activity and muscle mass and age. And something very noticeable happens at the age of 75. Of course, data like these cannot give us causality. In other words, can't tell us which one's causing the other. But I think anybody who's observed people at this age would come to the conclusion that there is bidirectional causality here. In other words, as we lose muscle mass, we become less active, and as we become less active, we lose muscle mass. And there's one point that I will make in addition to this, which actually came from a very recent interview I did with Luc Van Loon. And so that's an episode that you can go back and listen to in great detail if you haven't already. But Luc made a very interesting point, so interesting that I was scribbling it down as he said it, which was that data like these, which are, we're replete with these sorts of data that show population-based reductions in activity of aging individuals, always make it look like it's kind of a gradual, continuous curve. Even if it happens precipitously, it's still a continuous curve. And what Luc pointed out is, well, actually, that's true at the population level. It's not true at the individual level. At the individual level, it is a series of big, discrete drops. And so when you smooth out thousands of people with big discrete drops, it looks like a smooth drop. And what it really comes down to is once you reach a certain age, even minor setbacks become permanent setbacks. And that's the thing we're going to talk about, but we have to be able to avoid that situation. So I'll give you one example. People have long heard me talk about the idea that once you reach a certain age, like 65, and if you fall and break your hip or femur, the probability of death is really high. I mean, it's, on the order of 15 to 30%. What often gets forgotten there, even though I try to always mention it, is of the survivors, meaning the people who don't go on to die within 12 months, 50% of those people never reach the same level of function again. So that's an example of why these curves are probably not smooth, but in fact have these discrete step-offs.
And now, do you want to kind of talk in the same way about how you talked with the muscle and activity decline by looking at VO2 max?
Yes. So again, apologies for those not watching, but rather listening. Again, please take a look at the show notes. But here you can see a table that shows exactly what is happening to VO2 max as we age. Now, the purpose of this table, of course, is to show you something else. The purpose of this table is to show you basically the quartiles of VO2 max by age. So the way this table is broken up is that low, below average, above average, and then high and elite combined represent the 4 quartiles of VO2 max. The difference is that elite peels off the top 2.3% for each respective age and sex. And so we could talk about what that looks like, but I think a more important point, and the purpose of, I think, showing it here, is to give you a sense of how every one of these categories falls. In fact, what I think is most illustrative is to just look at the elite category. So again, these are the top 2.3% of the population. So for example, if you look at a woman in her late teens, the top 2.3% would have a VO2 max greater than 53 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. And you can see that that will fall such that by the time a woman is 80, to be in the top 3%, the top 2.3%, she would have to be greater than 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. But what's interesting is 30 places her in the bottom quartile for the late teens. It would place her at about the 25th percentile for someone in her 20s. So the implication here is that regardless of how fit you are, you can still expect to see a precipitous drop here. And as I've talked about many times, and certainly my patients are probably very sick of hearing this, the reason we want to see people, if they want to live a completely unencumbered life into the final decade of their life, and that's a big, if, not everybody necessarily has that type of an aspiration, but if your aspiration is indeed to basically be able to do what you want, without limitation, climb a flight of stairs, carry a luggage up a broken escalator, go for a hike, you pretty much need to be 2 decades younger at the elite level if you're thinking you're going to live to be about 90. So anyway, this hopefully provides some illustration of why that's the case.
Yeah, Peter, and I think that's really helpful for people to kind of see and hear. And it's almost like the why, right? So the why you should care about this, and why no matter what age you are, no matter how quote unquote old you are, you really do want to continue to think about this. And so now we'll get into a lot of what people are probably really curious on, is the how. So you've convinced me I need to care about this and I should do it, but how? And so I think the first question that would be helpful here is, what are the most important aspects of training if you're starting or even returning to exercise in later life? So this could be people who have never exercised, or this could be people who exercise all the way until they were 40, family life got busy, they took 10, 15, 20 years off, and now they want to get back into it.
I mean, I think there's a lot that one could say here, but I think you would want to start from the principles of exercise variability and movement quality will always trump volume, load, and intensity. So I would say that, I think most people listening would agree that that's an obvious statement to make for someone who's new to the game. But this is an example of something where I would say that's even true for someone like me. I have a very high training age. That's the term that we use when we're assessing patients to understand how much volume they've done and over what period of time. Right. So basically, with the exception of one very bad injury, 0 interruption in very high volume of training since the age of 13. And yet, as I'm now in my 50s, I realize I need to be much more attentive to these principles of exercise variability and movement quality. And the reason is quite simply, I'm much more prone to injury today than I was before. And so, I have to think of ways to challenge myself that are not just load dependent. And that doesn't mean that I don't still push load in complex movements like a deadlift. I do, but I'm clearly not going to do nearly as much load or volume in those regards. And I am going to want to challenge myself. And by saying this of myself, what I'm really saying is everybody should be thinking about this, especially at this age, in terms of, circuit training exercises where you're doing more than one thing at a time. So an example of this might be that, if someone were just starting out, I would want to see them doing more body weight exercises that are slightly more complex movements. So for example, a step back lunge is an important thing for them to be doing, even if it's just body weight, versus just working on a leg press with heavy weight. So again, there's a time and a place for using machines. And I think we'll talk about why I think machines are a very good thing for someone starting out, because they control the range of motion. But I think we must be able to mix that in with more complex movements that are variable in more than one plane. And for those movements, we obviously want to deload them so that we just begin to do the neuromuscular training.
And with that, let's say potential patient over 50 coming to you and saying, I want to start exercising, how are you going to start to think about the structure of the programming that you give them? Because again, you mentioned like the 4 pillars and there's different areas you could start. So how do you think about that person just taking that first step to exercise?
It always starts with a question that is obvious, but it sometimes is overlooked. And I have to be honest with you, this is something that even I think I overlooked a lot years ago. And that is, you have to come up with something that is realistic for a person, because the most important goal when you're returning someone to exercise or when you're starting someone from scratch is you want them to be able to look back in 3 months and view this as a positive experience. Nothing else matters if that is not true. So, if in 3 months you've improved them by every objective metric and they hated it or they're injured, well, I just don't know how to view that as a success. So people are going to be very different in terms of what their appetite for beginning is. But because we're focusing this discussion on people who are not like me, right? They aren't lifelong exercisers. And therefore, by definition, they're either starting from scratch or maybe coming back to it after a long hiatus. You have to assume that their appetite for training is not going to be 7 days a week, 2 hours a day. And therefore, what I really want to focus on is the habit of doing something active daily. And not, that doesn't mean training every day, but it means at least walking or doing something active. So again, you're going to evaluate them based on their fitness level, their level of conditioning. And again, at the most extreme level, if it's a person who's never done anything and is completely deconditioned, it's really going to be about walking, and that's about it. And it could be as little as 5,000 steps per day, every day, on relatively flat ground. And of course, there's so many ways to progress this. If a person is a little bit more conditioned, I do like to put weight on them out of the gate, right? I'd like to have them do some rucking. And again, we're not talking about putting 60 pounds on their back. It could be 20 pounds on their back, but getting them moving under a little bit of load. Again, there's lots of other things to consider here. So again, if a person is open to starting with some body weight exercises, that's a very helpful way to begin doing things. It doesn't have to be complicated, right? It could be, box squats, wall sits. Isometric things are much safer for individuals who haven't done conditioning in the past than isotonic movement based, meaning strength movements where the muscle is changing length. I don't know if you want to talk about more now versus later, but again, I have strong thoughts on how to begin cardio training. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of VO2 max. When we're working with a patient who hasn't done training, we do not do VO2 max workouts. I do not believe in starting people with interval training without building an aerobic base. And the aerobic base, of course, that's zone 2. You want to start building that in a manner that's kind of consistent with where they're coming from. So that might just be, again, walking. That could be incline walking. That could be riding a bike. And then even within riding a bike, how do you do that? Well, if a person doesn't have the lower back flexibility and strength, it might even be on a recumbent bike as opposed to just a regular stationary bike. So all of these things are considerations. But again, if you forget everything else, remember the following. You want to make sure that in 3 months, they feel better, they notice that they are fitter, and their appetite to exercise has grown. That's the most important thing if you're viewing this both as a participant or as a trainer.